Hello everyone, and welcome to this session on Asia-specific challenges for farmed animals, challenges and solutions, I should say. Welcome to the session. My name is Craig. I am from the Asia for Animals Coalition team, and I'm joined today by Amy Odene, who's the co-founder and strategic partnerships lead for Animal Ask, as well as Mark Dia, who's the global program director for the Animals in Farming program at World Animal Protection. Just before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to let you know what to expect from the session. So first of all, we'll hear from Amy from Animal Ask, and straight after that, we'll go into a session from Mark Dia from World Animal Protection. And then after both speakers have spoken, we'll open up the floor to a question and answer session, and we'll field as many questions as the time allows. Over on the left-hand side of your screen, you'll see a Ask a Question button. Please feel free to drop the questions in there and they'll be passed to me. I'd also like to let you know that, for those in the audience who may not know or haven't been to an AfA conference before, maybe you're not part of a group or maybe your group is in our network. Asia for Animals Coalition is here to act as a kind of bridge between the conferences, which happen every 2 years. And we hope that we do a better and better job all the time of, providing some kind of service to our network and sharing resources and strategies and whatnot. And in that light, I've come on board as the coordinator for farmed animal projects. So if anyone in the audience is in our network, or maybe you haven't yet joined, you can do so at asiaforanimals.com/join-AFA, join-AFA. If you are in our network and you'd like to check out some of those farm animal specific resources, you can head to asiaforanimals.com/farm. And you can also email me directly for support on farmed animal projects. I am Craig at farm@asiaforanimals.com. That's farm@asiaforanimals.com. So yeah, please be in touch and utilize AFA for any support we can give over the coming weeks and months. And for the rest of the afternoon, I'm also in the exhibition booth, so please message me there as well. So let's go into a session from Amy. So before establishing Animal Ask, Amy worked in the animal advocacy space as a campaigns manager for ProVeg UK and the global corporate relations at the Humane League UK. During her time at the Humane League, she collaborated with the Open Wing Alliance to coordinate major global commitments across the food sector to free hens from cages across the world. She's also spoken at major animal conferences on both plant-based advocacy and the overarching global landscape of factory farmed animals. I had the pleasure to meet her in person at the 2019 Asia for Animals conference in Dalian when the world was a little bit more normal, seems like so long ago. So it's great to see Amy here again. So yeah, let's hear Amy's presentation and take it away. Thank you.
Thank you for joining me at my talk at the Asia for Animals conference on optimizing and prioritizing farmed animal asks. My name is Amy Odene and I'm Strategic Partnerships Lead at Animal Ask. And I co-founded this organisation with George Bridgewater in September 2020 through the Charity Entrepreneurship Incubation Programme. I'm going to talk to you today about our research organisation, our research process, and also a case study from working with Synergia Animal on an ask in Southeast Asia. So we were founded with the express aim to optimise and prioritise future asks to assist the animal advocacy organisation movement in their efforts to reduce farmed animal suffering. So we provide organisations with in-depth research, narrowly targeted at key decisions between different animal asks, supporting both organisations and individuals who may be activists, policymakers or donors so that they may do more good in the long term. You might be thinking, what is an ask? How do we define what that means? And so here's our definition. So this is the specific request for industry, food companies, or the government to improve the welfare of the animals in their care. For example, this might be asking a retailer to commit to going cage-free for their eggs over a set period of time, or potentially asking the government to pass legislation to stop the live transport of animals. And these welfare asks are implemented over a set period of time, and if successful, can change the lives of millions of animals. But not all asks the movement makes of companies or governments are equally impactful, as you can see here. Perhaps Ask A is much less impactful than Ask B, and Ask C is slightly more impactful than Ask B. Therefore, good prioritization has the potential to greatly increase the effectiveness of our efforts. And we believe research is essential to making these well-informed decisions. And given the impressive increase in interest in farmed animal advocacy in Asia, we think that supporting this community in prioritizing the best asks is key. Charity entrepreneurship's research indicates that the difference in value between the best and worst asks already being reasonably considered could be as much as 3 times. And I want to just demonstrate what that might mean here in reality and what this could overall mean for the animals. So our research resource could contribute to assisting 3 times as many animal lives, for example. So we might find an optimal ask that gives us an opportunity to affect many more animals than what was being originally considered. Potentially, this ask could be 3 times as impactful for the animal's welfare. So perhaps it's an ask that was relatively simplistic, and we believe we can push that further to impact the overall animal's welfare much more, potentially 3 times more. Or it could be 3 times as tractable, meaning we could get 3 times as many companies to agree, or 3 times as many members of the public to get behind the ask. So this is kind of what that impact can look like overall. Now, I'd like you to have a little think about your organisation and how potentially you currently decide to work on different projects, what that process might look like. Perhaps the decision is reactive to something that's come out in the press, or perhaps you have quite heavy funder influence, or maybe it's just personal preference from your leadership over which asks you do and don't work on. And there's so many decisions involved in this decision, so many elements involved in this decision making, and that's what we aim to try and make a bit clearer. So we go through this full process. So it may originally, right now, look something like this. Many questions we need to ask of ourselves when starting to work on a new project. So we need to know the species, are we working on fish or hens or potentially pigs? Which welfare measure are we looking to improve? Are there other NGOs in the region or organisations working on this issue? Would that be a good collaboration, or actually could it be a conflict of interest to have multiple groups working on the same thing? Over to if you have flexibility around which country you work within, it would be great to do scoping to work out where you could have the most impact in terms of your location. What does the literature say? Is there any scientific literature to back the ask? How expensive is it going to be for both you as an organisation, but also from a producer perspective? Is it practical for them to be implementing? Maybe considering what public opinion is. Do the public care about this particular species or this particular welfare ask? And so we've got all these questions to ask, and we want to pull all of that together to provide you with one optimal ask that we believe will be successful. So when starting our organisation, the main goal for this pilot year was to collaborate with an existing organisation in the animal advocacy space, offering our research resource for free to support the movement with stronger ask prioritisation, while simultaneously testing our research model and our research process. So we were looking for an organisation, and we decided to work with Synergia Animal, who got in touch with us wanting to start work on fish. So Synergia Animal came to us specifically wanting to start working on fish in Southeast Asia, in 2 countries specifically within that region, on either a corporate or producer campaign. So it could be either working with retailers or producers themselves. And very specifically, they wanted to impact the largest number of individuals possible. So we start our process. So we start country scoping to ensure we have a real basic understanding of the context required to complete this work. What does the public think of animal welfare generally in the region? Are there any cultural considerations we need to bear in mind? Any barriers that we might face? So it's really important to start with this relatively in-depth country scoping. And then we go into the research rounds. So we do round 1, round 2, and round 3. And within these, there's different clusters of evidence providing us with different perspectives that we can combine to increase our confidence in the ideal ask. And these are a weighted factor model, expert opinions, and cost effectiveness analysis. And I'm going to go through these now so you can get a full idea of the service that we're able to offer. So we start with the weighted factor model, and we've got many questions to ask of ourselves and of the research at this point. We want to assess the strength of the idea. Does the ask seem robustly good and highly valued by the animal? Are we confident that implementation of this ask would have a large effect on the animal's quality of life? So we carry out a welfare estimate for each ask. We want to know behavioural indicators. We want to know about mortality. What percentage of the animal's life does this ask affect? Actually, more on how we measure animal welfare can be found on our website. We've just released an extensive report on this. And we want to know how well evidenced this ask is, and are the sources from which we get that information sufficiently robust? We then move on to tractability. So we want to know overall how tractable is the ask. So starting with feasibility, we want to know the speed of implementation. If we asked a producer to do a specific ask, could they implement it tomorrow, or is it going to take 5, maybe 10 years? Are there any bottlenecks in the space where we might find challenges? Does it require significant investment or training of staff? Is it something that they would need to budget to offer training? What about public support? Are there any asks that currently exist where we can garner some similar support? Are there any existing polls in the region for what the public might think about this issue? And how easy is it to mobilise activists who we know are this integral part of a lot of campaigning work? How easily is it measured? Are we able to enforce it? Can we go to a farm and understand and see that it's actually being enforced? And how complex is it? So how difficult is it to communicate, not only to the public, but also to the companies themselves? Internally, will they generally understand what we're trying to achieve? And how complex is it based on different species and potentially different life stages? So lots to consider in this section. We then move on to counterfactual replaceability. So are the farmers likely to change without our help? In which case, maybe we should be focusing our efforts on a different ask. And is the issue being pushed from groups on other grounds, for example, environmental grounds, in which case, again, maybe it would be a more useful use of our resource and time to look at a different ask. And then finally, just any externalities that come up during the process. So is there a way that this particular ask could affect the animal advocacy movement in a negative way? Or does it do the opposite? Does it actually help and expand the moral circle of the public, meaning that overall asks in the future could be more successful? And so all of these areas are numerically scored based on the literature that we can find in the research that we do. And this accumulates to a total score to be added to both the expert opinion and the cost effectiveness analysis. So in terms of expert opinion, we speak to experts in academia, animal welfare, the industry themselves, NGOs who might have experience in campaigning or corporate relations, and certification bodies who are useful to bring into this conversation. And we take general impressions from these conversations and interviews, or sometimes the experts will rank the asks from 0 to 10, giving us a really good idea of how they rate that particular ask. And again, this is totaled and scored and added to this overall assessment. We then move on to a cost effectiveness analysis, sometimes called a cost benefit or cost utility analysis, which tries to come up with a single metric to compare the benefits of 2 or more different interventions side by side. So in our particular ask comparison, we're working out from a producer perspective, which asks are going to be most cost effective. So for example, out of transport and antibiotic use, which provides us with a sense of which welfare benefit relative to the cost for producers scores most highly. We want to know what is the highest welfare benefit we can gain for the price increase available before it's too high that the ask is just overall likely to fail. We also model the ask as a whole, seeing what effect it would have on consumer pricing and potentially therefore consumption, as well as how many farms or retailers this might affect, therefore how many animal lives we could affect per staff outreach each year. We overall acknowledge the challenges with CEAs and that there's no kind of perfect system to measure this, but we still feel like it's a really important analysis to make alongside both the weighted factor model and the expert opinion. And it's only in the combined scores of all these systems that we're able to rank the ask through this robust method. So we pull together the scorings from all of the different categories, and this produces an average score. These are just for demonstration, these particular figures. So here for stocking density, it's scored in the top 5%. Transport came through in the top 10%, but the experts kind of pulled this one down. Antibiotic use did poorly across the board and was in the lowest percentile overall. And this ranking happens through each round until each ask has a number, and then this will conclude with a final ask recommendation. So for Synergia, we started with country scoping for their chosen countries and moved on to the formation of the ask list. So these are made up of single asks, which could just be a transport ask, and composite asks, which could be transport combined with stocking density and antibiotic use and something to do with water quality. So they're how we split those asks out. So we start with round one, which compiles around 50 asks, and we go through the three sections: weighted factor model, cost effectiveness analysis, and expert opinion. And we do it for a relatively short period of time for those 50 asks. Once we've done the prioritization, we then take that down to about 25 for round two, going through the same three elements, but this time for longer, looking into these asks for a longer period of time. Through to the final round, where maybe there's only 5 asks, and we do an extensive report on these asks through those 3 sections again, resulting in one final recommended ask. We complete our research with this one recommended intervention that we believe has the greatest overall potential impact. And it's an ask that the organisation can have confidence in, knowing how many thorough elements of the process have been considered and assessed comparatively to all other possible asks. Here's a quote from Synergia, just to talk a little bit about our work. It's great to hear from them how the relationship's going so far. So they said, Animal Ask came to us in a good moment to step up our work in Southeast Asia, boosting our research regarding fish welfare. We believe millions of animals can benefit from this partnership, as the region is one of the biggest fish producers and consumers in the world. And so I want to ask you today if this research resource appeals to you or your organisation, and we can take all of these questions that we spoke about and all of this research that feels quite overwhelming at times, and we can change this into one recommended optimal ask for you, then please get in touch with us. We would love to hear from you. Thank you. I look forward to any questions at the end of the session.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that, Amy. Great presentation. As I said, we will take questions for Amy towards the end of the session, and please use the Ask a Question button on the left-hand side there to do so. We'll go straight into a session by Mark Dia, as I said, the Global Program Director for the Animals and Farming Program at WAP. So Mark has been working on various social and environmental issues globally and across Asia for more than 30 years. He's lived and worked in Thailand, Indonesia, Japan, China, India, and several other Asian locations. So he's very familiar with the challenges in campaigning in the region. And aside from that, he can also order vegetarian food and tell jokes in several Asian languages, something, both things I'm very jealous of, actually, and could have made a great use of when traveling in Asia. So yeah, as I said, he currently heads up the program for animals and farming at WAP. So let's hear now the presentation from Mark Dia. Thank you.
Good day to everyone and welcome to this session. Let me just share my screen. So hello to all of you. I'm Mark Dia, the Global Director of World Animal Protection's Farm Animal Program. Some of you may know the organization as the World Society for the Protection of Animals. We changed our name a while back to reflect the changes in our focus and our campaigning. We operate in more than 40 countries and have offices in 13 different areas across the Americas, Europe, Africa, India, China, Southeast Asia, and Australia, New Zealand. So we are in a region where we have around half of the world's farmed land animals and around 90% of the world's farmed fish. This, as you know, is expected to grow even further in the next couple of decades. This is also a region where we have multiple and overlapping issues of concern. It is important that we consider a one health and one welfare approach when we plan our campaigns. And here we look at the interconnectivity between animals, people, and planet. In these intersections between, say, animal welfare and human health, we see the issues of zoonotic disease, antibiotic use, superbugs, food security, nutrition, quite relevant today in this era of a pandemic. In the intersection between animal welfare and the environment, we see the issues around animal feed, habitat loss, water pollution. Really in the middle, we see the issues that affect all of us, greenhouse gas emissions, nitrogen and phosphorus, pollution, biodiversity loss, areas that we call the planetary limits, and some of them we have already reached. It's in this context that we have shifted in world animal protection from campaigning on incremental change that could have the effect of sometimes even entrenching the status quo and then toward shifting our work in shifting systems. So there are two main goals that we're focusing on. Some of my colleagues over this weekend are talking about wild animals. But I will focus on our program on farmed animals, wherein we are hoping to transform the global food system so that farmed animals can live a good life. Some major elements of this work for us for farm animals in this strategy is major interventions. One on shifting the narrative so that factory farming is not seen as necessary to feed the world. A second major intervention is what we call the food revolution, wherein we're weaning the world off factory farm products and providing affordable and accessible alternatives for all. And the last intervention is disrupting public and private finance flows from factory farming towards what we call humane and sustainable solutions. There are, as you know, multiple challenges for animal welfare campaigning, particularly farm animal welfare campaigning in Asia. I won't focus on all of them, but let's look at a few. And one is the area of weak policy and sometimes even weaker implementation. Let's look at the Animal Protection Index. This is a tool that we have developed at World Animal Protection. And it's looking at scoring for various countries on their policies and implementation, policies and regulations on animal welfare. The address is below if you'd like to look at that at a later time. So let's go through the tool and choose several countries: Malaysia, Philippines, China, and Vietnam. And let's compare that. You're going to see here that the recognition of animal sentience in legislation for some of the countries is quite patchy, and laws against animal suffering is also hit and miss. What's worrying is that in terms of protecting animals in farming, the scoring is quite dismal. And there is generally poor accountability for animal welfare. This is what we're up against with regards to policy and legal work across the region. And a pathway really is for us to choose strategic battles on policy and legislation across where we work. Some of these campaigns can be very costly, time consuming, and we really need to establish landmark legislation that would have the ability to affect a wider segment of this domain. Another major challenge we have is the increasing demand for cheap meat. And this is not just about the increasing demand for cheap meat across the Asian region, but there are also some consequences of things that are happening in other places that that exacerbate this problem. Let's look at a case in point. The UK and EU in particular are committed to be net zero by 2050. A lot of food companies have set targets, and this net zero carbon commitments includes reducing emissions as well as offsetting. There is a real risk that consumers, upon government advice or what have you, will shift from high emissions to low emission animal products like red meat and dairy towards chicken and fish. This could lead to increased production demand from Asian countries or producing countries, which then aggravates issues in farm animal welfare across Asia. If we would look at the meat production projections across the region, this is the general trajectory that we're facing. But with new demand coming in, any improvements that we make could easily be wiped out. In Indonesia, as an example, the latest statistics says that in 2020, there were nearly 3 billion broiler chickens. And this is a huge amount by any standard. So unless we're able to improve the welfare issues for this industry, any increase in the production will as I've mentioned earlier, wipe out any advantages that we have as a campaigning community on farm animal welfare. So we should be prepared for unintended consequences on other areas of campaigning, and we need to draw our red lines on these. The other area of concern or challenge is the relatively small resources that's allocated for farm animal welfare in the region. We recognize this limitation and the need to increase the resources and campaigning power for farm animal welfare. There are very few organizations that are specifically focused on farm animal welfare across Asia. But there are many organizations that are either in the animal welfare or protection space in general, and even a larger number of groups that have concerns or campaigns with direct relation to animal welfare issues. So we work with the Open Philanthropy project to help build capacity in farm animal welfare campaigning across Southeast Asia in particular. We call this the Investing in Others program in Southeast Asia. And through this program, we've helped fund and support a Better Chicken Option campaign for the Philippine Animal Welfare Society in the Philippines on their broiler chicken campaign, Farmed Shrimp Protection and Welfare Project by Tambuyog Development Center in the Philippines, but hopefully expanding that across the region. YLKI on consumer awareness of antimicrobial resistance on the broiler food chain, the Fish Welfare Initiative on a scoping report, Evergreen Social Ventures on a Humane Egg Project in Vietnam, and ProVeg on their Food Innovation Challenge. One thing that was evident was the need to have a common minimum standard to aim for when demanding farm animal welfare improvements across the region. As a community, we need to demand that poor welfare and a life not worth living is unacceptable. On factory farms that dominate the food system, minimum standards should be designed to minimize suffering and give animals a life worth living, with no cages, overcrowding, painful mutilations, unhealthy environments, minimal transport, and humane death. We also advocate for all farms in a future food system to be built around the welfare needs of animals, where they will have mainly positive experiences and a good life. So World Animal Protection, together with the Humane Society International and Compassionate World Farming, have co-developed what we call FARMS, or Farm Animal Responsible Minimum Standards. The goal is to ultimately support meat, milk, and egg producers and other companies in the supply chain towards meeting the responsible minimum standards with respect to how farm animals are raised, transported, and slaughtered. This covers pigs, cattle, layer hens, broiler chickens, and dairy animals. These standards are based on a range of existing international frameworks and standards, including the 5 Freedoms, the World Organization for Animal Health, or OIE, section on animal welfare in the Terrestrial Animal Health Code, and the International Finance Corporation's Good Practice Note on improving animal welfare and livestock operations. The FARMS initiative has taken the principles on welfare risks and accompanying mitigation strategies set out in the Good Practice Note, and developed specific requirements that emerge from these for a number of the farm species that I've mentioned earlier. We have also started the work on advising financial corporations, insurance, and banking to be able to look at these risks and be able to shift their portfolio towards better welfare. So what are the welfare risks? These are the limitation on space, barren and unsuitable environments, inappropriate diets, breeding and genetics, painful procedures, species-specific production, transport, slaughter, and then compliance and transparencies. You could see in the color codes on where these applies to specific species. So there is a need for us to coordinate our asks, especially on the floor or minimums for farm animal welfare standards across the region. And we hope that we can all campaign together and support each other so that we are coordinated when we do our work in the future. And here's a big one. Animal welfare is really not an urgent issue where we are. So let's look at an example for a polling that was done for China. You could see that animal welfare is really very low on the priority for consumers and for the general public. For Indonesia and Thailand, it's the same. The concern about how chickens and pigs are raised, when we did our polling for quick service restaurants, it's very low. However, there is an opportunity here because we see that there are areas where people are concerned wherein we could link farm animal welfare issues, such as health, environment, and other areas. Hence, we could redirect the attention to the concept of a humane and sustainable protein. And there's 2 elements of that, which is humane on animal welfare and a good life, and sustainable protein, wherein food security and nutrition for all doesn't compromise the same for future generations. There are many things that need to change. Currently, 41% of crops consumable by human beings is fed to livestock, and we only get really a proportion of the nutrients had we, instead of consuming those nutrients directly, we're losing a lot in the system. So a vital step towards a humane and sustainable food system ensures that farm animals do not consume food suitable for humans. Farm animals will only convert food that we cannot consume, and existing farms meet higher welfare criteria. New farms in the future will be innovating to be humane and sustainable. We use the 5 domains model, where the welfare provisions of nutrition, physical environment, health, behavioral interactions contribute to a positive mental state. This is where we hope animals will experience a good life with mostly positive experiences. This is then within what we call the sustainable food system. So really, it's looking at things very holistically when we campaign for the future. So we have a systems problem, ultimately, and we need system solutions to be able to address these. The fight is long, but hopefully we can all work together and campaign together for a better future for farm animals. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that, Mark. And just like to apologize to the audience for the, if we had a technical glitch there, we had to restart the presentation if the audio was bad. So thanks for bearing with us. I'm sorry that we've missed out on a little bit of time because of that for the Q&A. Just before we do open the floor for questions, I'd just like to mention that Mark mentioned in his talk about World Animal Protection's Investing in Others funding program. You can find this and other funding opportunities in the resource table that I've made at asiaforanimals.com/farm. And just like to mention as well that if that program for any reason wasn't right for your organization, please go to the exhibitor booth today and talk to Compassion in World Farming and ProVeg Grants team about the same thing. Okay, great. So we have a question here for Amy from Siobhan. And she asks, thank you for such a great insight into your research. I'm interested to understand at what point in an organization's development and therefore its size, this approach is most appropriate and of most benefit. For example, how grassroots organizations might be able to apply and translate this methodology to their setup. Amy, thank you.
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. I think for us, however kind of large or small the resource of the organization is, optimizing what you're working on and putting that resource into is always of value. And perhaps it's interesting to consider using, I guess, elements of our process, and probably not the full ask prioritization process. Is if the resource is grassroots and relatively small, I would say just utilizing some of the elements to try and help you break that down. For example, connecting with experts and speaking to experts who have great opinions on, maybe have experience in working on these types of asks in the past. So yeah, for me, it's about working on the neglected ask in your region. And so I think whilst the whole process is perhaps not as useful to grassroots, certainly getting in touch with us and us working with you through elements of the process, I think it is always going to be useful no matter the size of the resource.
Great, thank you for that. Yeah, it's good to know that targeted approaches like that are kind of not just accessible to really established groups. So thank you. Yeah. I've got a question for Mark. So World Animal Protection's Animals in Farming program is obviously very comprehensive and it covers all angles when it comes to welfare. As you also look to encompass sustainable diets, do you think that any major food producers you engage with will be kind of threatened or challenged by the fact that the terminology animal protection is in your name? I'm thinking of a recent study showing that animal welfare was not actually a key deciding factor for decision makers in the food industry in Asia. And how do you navigate this? Thanks.
Yeah, so thanks for that question. Very interesting. There's several elements to that. I think a lot of the food companies, especially those that have animal welfare as part of what they would like to address, consciously do not put animal welfare as a major I guess message, because it's really talking about the business of food. Although there are companies that like Just really have longer term vision of ending factory farms themselves. So we have had quite a bit of work in the US with our office there, and we've spoken to quite a few companies to talk about diversifying their portfolio. And what we have found is that there is actual interest to be able to diversify the portfolio. Whether or not that's particularly related to animal welfare, of course, it's not something we will ever know. But I think there is massive interest at the moment. This industry is growing year on year. I believe it grew about 16-18% last year. Whether or not that's actually going to shift everything in a big way over the next 10 years, that remains to be seen. We at World Animal Protection do not think so by itself. It will have to come with a lot of other things that we'll need to do. There's policy, there's challenging factory farms. There's also supporting distributed farming, so on and so forth. So I think it's actually quite complicated, the issue. But going back to the question, I don't think companies themselves are threatened by that. What we need to watch out for is companies diversifying their portfolio, and it does not result in an actual meat reduction in the future. Because what could happen is that they will just add more options for people, so that they could diversify their portfolio and earn profit in another sector, but not necessarily make those commitments to actual meat reduction and meat consumption reduction. And I think as animal protection organizations, we will need to make sure that that's something that we're looking into.
Great, thank you for that, Mark. Yeah, you're absolutely right. It just has to remain a multi-pronged approach from our whole movement, doesn't it? So yeah, great. Another question for Amy. Are there any stages of your process that you talk this through, such as maybe the expert opinion stage in the example in Southeast Asia that you gave, which were challenged by language or cultural barriers? Was it necessary for the client organization Synergia to help facilitate such barriers? Did you have any learnings from it for future research projects, such as working with local consultants, that kind of thing?
Yeah, it's a great question, and something we, of course, consider very thoroughly in our work. We're really aware of it being a collaboration overall with the group, wherever they're based, in terms of who we work with. I think for the experts in particular, the process has been a collaboration, and Synergia Animal have been incredibly helpful. They have conducted interviews in the regions themselves, and then we have had those translated for our purposes. So yeah, I definitely think, obviously this is our pilot, so this is the first time we're kind of trialing this, and that has worked really well for us this time. It was also our intention to actually go to the regions and to do field research in the countries themselves, and unfortunately the pandemic has meant that has not been possible this time round, but it is a part of our standard process that we would visit the countries and like you say, maybe carry out some interviews there with a translator to help support us in our research. So yeah, definitely something that we are keen to do, and yeah, hopefully we'll be less restricted in the next cycle to be able to do that more extensively.
Yeah, absolutely. And Asia is it's home to most of the world's farmed animals, but it's also such a diverse region with so many languages and cultures. So great to know that you can navigate that in the future. I just want to double check. I can see the MC Sarah Berry here in our backstage area. I just want to check that we do have the 10 minutes more, for some questions. Not eating into anyone's time. That's great. Okay, great. I have a question for both speakers here. So you both indicated in your presentations how very, very long the road is to making a better world for farmed animals. And an ultimate part of this is that the current consumption and suffering it simply can't continue at this volume. Both your organizations take a very targeted, detailed, pragmatic and patient approach. But do you think there are elements of your approach which can also be applied to demand reduction work, which can try to accelerate that element in the public consciousness? So maybe if Amy wants to take that question first.
Yeah, sure. That's very interesting. I think perhaps Mark is better placed to answer. I think our focus really is on the welfare and less on the demand side of things. However, I do think when we work that into the cost effectiveness analysis, that's a big part for us. So we want to make sure that each ask is not only benefiting the animals in the short term, but that overall the likelihood is that there would be, with improved welfare comes a price increase, and therefore demand would certainly be reduced. So whilst it's an element for us, yeah, I think perhaps Mark has more detail there.
Thanks, Amy. So we have 10 minutes, right, Craig? Just to put that in context, I think in my presentation, I did show that I think part of the challenge in the region and many other places is that animal welfare in general and farm animal welfare in particular is really not high in people's agenda. It's when people think about animals, they think about food, like a fried chicken here in Southeast Asia in particular, in other places. But I think we do have a major opportunity to link issues that people do care about that are very much directly related to factory farms. And I've mentioned one aspect of it. And I think this has been mentioned all over since yesterday and today, the issue of antibiotic use. 130,000 tons of the antibiotics being used every year, or about 75%, is going into into agriculture. And that's a huge amount. We just did a big report wherein we saw fluoroquinolones, macrolides, and colistin. These are antibiotics that are very important to the public health sector, and factory farms in areas where they operate. We have found major incidents of antibiotic-resistant genes downstream and upstream. So if you look at a public health issue and link that to factory farms and then link that to the food we eat, I think that we have a major opportunity to link that. Climate change is another major aspect of that. A significant amount of the resources going into factory farms are coming from feed, a significant amount, mainly soya. And as we know, soya plantations, soya farming is one of the major causes of habitat loss globally. So I think there's opportunities to be able to link those issues. And as I mentioned earlier, I think there's a really growing movement of people who are concerned about various things, and the intersection of those issues is on food. So I think, especially in Asia, food is such a central part of everyday life. It's a cultural thing, it's a religious thing. And if we're able to link it towards animal welfare and global issues that people care about, I think we have a massive opportunity to do a demand reduction, but also a production reduction across the region. As we say, if we are able to do some changes here in Asia, I think that's going to resonate around the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're right, that sentiment has been echoed all throughout this weekend. We still have 3 minutes, so I'm just going to try and squeeze in one last question for Mark. I've heard from some in the cultured protein space that their industry is not made up 100% of colleagues who are motivated by their care for animals. There are other factors like, it's a new science field, etc. So even though the internal and external focus in that industry is not explicitly on helping animals, does World Animal Protection see the value or even priority in working in synergy with the cultured protein industry to accelerate it? If so, how can you do this? And do you think Asia will be the front runner for consuming those kind of products, being that Singapore is currently leading the way? Thanks.
Yeah, that's true. As some of you would know, Singapore has already approved cultured meat, or clean meat, or lab meat, as we call it, for sale and for consumption in Singapore. It's very small at the moment, but I think it's getting there. We know that India, China have been putting in quite a bit of resources into this space. I think in the future, where it's going to be a game changer would be when we, amongst other things, would be price parity. And I think this goes to the same space with also plant-based alternatives. Even in our other campaigns on higher welfare meat, I think there needs to be a price comparison, price parity, because if it's going to be priced outside of the reach of most people, then it becomes a niche product. Then we're back to square one on this issue. But going back again to the question, very quickly, we support this space. There are some concerns at the moment, but I think overall it's actually quite positive. And if there's opportunities to be able to displace meat for those that are eating meat and would like to still continue eating meat, we think this is a way forward globally. It will take a bit of time, a couple of years in the future, but we're looking at how this is going to actually fundamentally change the industry.
Yeah, well, I'm a personal advocate for advancing that industry as well, and it's great to know that huge organisations like WAP are behind it. So, yeah, well, that brings us almost to the end of our session. I'd just like to thank Amy and Mark once again for their time and their presence here, and some great questions and answers, and some valuable insights. Once again, please feel free to contact me at farm@asiaforanimals.com. You know, between the conferences, if you have any support that we can give to particularly grassroots groups to try and help uplift or progress your farm work. And with that, I'll just thank Amy and Mark again, and I'll hand over now to the MC, Sarah B. Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much, Greg, and thank you, Amy. Thank you, Mark, for those great presentations and those wonderful inputs. I'm sure it must have benefited the audience manyfold. Thank you so much for the time and the effort that you've put in, both of you, and Greg for the great moderating.